And welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi. Joining me is my co-host, Shayne Kubas. We've got so much to talk about today. The Steelers made some very unusual trades just before the trade deadline, and they went backwards the other way, something they typically don't do. And so we're going to find out if that's going to be the trend of things to come. Under the new GMs in the front office there, or if this is something that we shouldn't get used to. But we're going to talk a lot about the Chase Claypool trade, other moves the Steelers could have potentially made, and then how to rebuild for the future going forward if we're the Pittsburgh Steelers. So let's start with, briefly, the Steelers game against the Eagles. This was not fun. I mean, of all my years of watching Steelers football that dates back to the 90s, I don't remember a game quite as discouraging as this one.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't watched quite that long, Tommy, but obviously it's just hard to see a team that you're so accustomed to being in games like this, big games and against tough opponents, and at the very least, maybe not always winning, of course, but being competitive with them, showing that they can hang with them, right? And it was so apparent early on that we're just not at their level, and we're not going to be this year, at least for sure. And I think hopefully it does lead to good things. We're going to talk about some of that stuff. And I'm sure some of that game is going to, it did influence some of the things they decided to do, but it was definitely still tough to watch regardless.
Yeah, and the Steelers fall to 2-6 with that loss, which means that they're not eliminated from playoff contention. But we're looking at this team right now. They are the dead last offense in the NFL in terms of points per game, yards per play, and they're just atrocious right now. I mean, they can't keep it competitive against good teams like Buffalo and the Eagles. In fact, they just get blown out to the point where these teams are putting their backups in the fourth quarter. And so not at all what we want to see from a Steelers team. And it makes me wonder if the Steelers had lost that Buccaneers game, like if they didn't hang on to that one and they're 1-7 right now, would they maybe have been even a little bit more proactive before the trade deadline? I don't know. There's still a glimmer of hope, but if you map it out, like mathematically, the Steelers could go 7-2 after the bye week and still miss the playoffs. That would give them a 9-8 record, in which we saw last year the Chargers missed the playoffs at 9-8. And so it's possible to do that. I don't know if it's possible to get to 7-2. That would require a lot of changes. I know TJ Watt's going to be coming back, but it's going to take a whole lot more than that. And so just kind of a discouraging outlook leading up to the bye altogether. So let's jump into some winners and losers real quick here. Hard to really pinpoint the winners, but Shayne, I'll let you start that off.
For me, I mean, you like you said, it's hard, right? I mean, the pass rush wasn't bad in this game. I'll give them that. I mean, overall, like it clearly wasn't, consistent, and Hurts still did what he wanted to do and really linked up, especially with AJ Brown. But they did get after him a little bit. We did have 3 sacks in the game, and Cam Hayward was a big part of that too. He's always going to be pretty much a winner unless he just doesn't get involved because they cover him with 3 guys every week. But the pass rush was okay. I think the running game late, obviously, now the problem with that is a lot of it's because they were just letting us run the ball. But they at least looked a little bit better, I guess, on that end of things. The numbers look better, but a lot of that was, like I said, more context-based and game script than actually just successful running, especially early. Cam Sutton, I thought, had a good game. The secondary outside of him definitely had one of their worst performances of the year, but I think that he held up really well. So that's definitely good to see. But like you said, it's hard to find a lot of winners in this game when you lose 35, 35-13 like that.
Yeah, certainly not like really anybody that stands out like in a drastic way. Not on that side of the fence, at least. I would say Jaylen Warden, I thought looked pretty good in the second half there.
Yeah,
I know a lot of people get irritated because I agree. You got to take things in context. Warren's carries came in a different situation where it wasn't necessarily as hard as what Najee had to deal with in front of him. However, with a hole there, he hit it hard. He averaged 8.3 yards a carry. You could see him in the passing game. Like you just sidestep a guy and get 15 yards on one of those swing pass receptions late in the game. And so I think there's some to look forward to there with Jaylen Warren. I agree with Cam Sutton, Cam Hayward. Outside of that, it's like, who else do you put on a pedestal here and bring them up? Like, I don't think that like a player like Freiermuth was detrimental to the game at all. Just didn't really make a big impact because the offense was just so bad as a whole. So let's talk about our losers real quick. And there's no end to the names that you could list here, really.
I mean, the first guy that I think you kind of have to talk about is Akella Weatherspoon. He got benched by halftime, and for very good reason. I mean, granted, there was a couple plays by the safeties that you would have liked, especially like Minka, to make. That just again, sometimes those are going to go your way, right? Like, and it's hard to really sit there and say, "Oh, Minka's the reason why we gave up how many points," but Kello was just getting cooked, and it's AJ Brown. Most guys aren't going to be able to hold up with him very well, but it was just so easy for Hurts just to drop it in the bucket over top of Witherspoon. It made it really tough on the safeties because they knew if they didn't get over there in time that basically it was a touchdown. And that's what we saw. And I think that as good as he was last year, he's been equally as bad this year. That's kind of been the book on him throughout his career. And that's kind of the concern is you were hoping for cornerback one play from him, hopefully, and we just haven't gotten it this year.
Completely different story, than what we've seen last year. I think over the last 5 or 6 games, he was really strong and had those 3 starts down the stretch. Last year, Ahkello Witherspoon gave up a 35.1 passer rating. Like, that's impressive. That's top-notch stuff. And so when the Steelers signed him to a 2-year deal, I was encouraged by that, knowing that like he needed to play that way for this cornerback room to really have a chance to be one of the better secondaries collectively, along with the safeties in the NFL this year. Has not been the case. He's allowed 128 passer rating. I think that was 128 against the Eagles, and it's over like 106, I believe, on the season. It's not good. It's not at all where you want it to be. And I feel bad for him a little bit because some of those were just like dropped in the bucket. Like,
they were good throws, but
it's like the coverage was tight. You just still have to be in the position to make a play on the ball. And so he's benched. I don't like the outlook of the cornerbacks going forward at all. Now we've got James Pierre and Levi Wallace. Those are both 4'6" guys. Like there's no speed in athleticism out there at cornerback at all. And Cam Sutton is just an average athlete. He's undersized, but he's certainly the best of the group. I don't like their boundary cornerbacks at all. I think that's a position that they are absolutely going to have to address either early in the draft or with good money in free agency. The rest of the team, I just thought they were humiliated. Like the offensive line was bulldozed. It's really sad when you watch that game and see Kevin Dotson give up like 3 big plays, including a strip sack. And yet he's one of the highest graded offensive players in that game because
exactly.
there's nobody else to point to. And so I don't think it was encouraging at all. So let's transition to that over to talking about Kenny Pickett and his start against the Eagles. I really wanted to see him start trending that other direction where it's like, all right, this is what we have to look forward to. Unfortunately, I was more discouraged than anything by his performance. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, I think the problem with this ultimately, and I think part of the reason why I wanted to be more excited about his transition to be the starting quarterback this year, because we got to see what he could possibly be, and they get a jump on evaluating him. But I really don't know how easy it is to evaluate him based on how the offense is being run and how the players are playing around him. He's making his own mistakes, and he's going to because he's a rookie. But things are made 10 times harder on him by everything else going on. And I'm worried that by the end of the season, we will not know much about him, right? Because regardless of how good or bad he plays the rest of the year, you're going to be able to say, well, what if the offense was even remotely, even average as far as play calling goes? What if the receivers had played up to their potential? What if this and that? Like, you don't know what it would have looked like with even an average, base around him. So it is discouraging to see him play poorly the way he has so far. And he has made a lot of bad decisions himself, which is part of the problem. But I think at some point, whenever you look at a guy like him and really any rookie quarterback, when things are as bad around him as they are, they just decide, I'm going to try to do something. Like, I'm going to try to make something happen. And that leads to bad decisions, unfortunately. And I'm hopeful that part of his game will go away. He really wasn't that type of player, even in college. He was pretty safe with the football overall, I would say. He just, right now, you can tell that between turnover luck being on his side, he hasn't had as many turnover-worthy plays as interceptions. The offense just not really moving consistently. There's no semblance of, ground game or any rhythm to anything. You hope that going into next year, when things are inevitably going to change, whether it's before the end of the year or going into next year, you hope that he has a better base to work with next year, but missing out on a lot of the evaluation process for him this year is really a bad thing for the Steelers at this point.
Yeah, and the decision-making and accuracy was a little bit spotty in that Eagles game. Like, he airmailed that one over Freiermuth on the 3rd and 10, and he was wide open on that play, and that's one that should have been interception. So even if you say that, well, he got unlucky with the tip pass being picked at the end of the game, he deserved
it. Should have been at least one, either way.
Yeah, he deserved at least one anyway. And, I mean, we just saw the Colts offensive coordinator get fired, and their offense isn't as bad as with the Steelers.
Exactly.
I know everybody is hoping that Canada would get fired, but if it hasn't happened at this point, we're 3 days past the game, it's not going to happen, unfortunately, at least not in this point in time, because again, there is your window. The Steelers have 2 weeks. 2 weeks is not a long time to make a transition to an interim offensive coordinator. But if you were to do it, you need to do it immediately. And so you can start making those changes for this next game. Hasn't happened yet. I don't foresee it happening in the Steelers' way. They're probably going to wait until the end of the season, unfortunately. And like you said, we might not know a lot about Kenny Pickett at that point. And that's the issue that we're running into now, because he is so capped with that offense. We really need to see him shine and kind of be himself, so we know what we're getting here, or if we need to kind of look at other options, even as early as next year's draft, because who knows, maybe that's on the table. Let's transition here. And I want to talk about the trades, because this is by far the biggest news pertaining to the Steelers right now. The Steelers made 2 trades before the deadline yesterday. In just hours before the deadline, they traded Chase Claypool away to the Chicago Bears. And then they traded for a cornerback, William Jackson. I love one. I don't like the other one so much. So let's talk about the Chase Claypool trade first, because this one obviously has the much bigger impact on the team, and it will going forward. What do you make of that trade?
I think it's very strange that it ended up being the Bears with that high of a second-round pick. And it's not so much that the Bears don't need the help, or that other teams that apparently like the Packers were interested. Like, that makes sense. But giving up your second-round pick, when even adding Chase and trending a little bit up offensively last few weeks, the Bears are not going to be a good football team this year. They don't even seem like they're interested in being a good football team. They trade away Roquan Smith too. Like, they are trending to having like a top 10 pick in the draft, and now we'll have their second-round pick. I think that it's a lot to give up for a player that has really only shown you flashes since an excellent rookie season, right? And that's ultimately why he was on the block, I think, because the Steelers knew that it's very unlikely that he'd be on the team past next year, and that even if he played well the rest of this year and next year, you're not going to obviously get anything higher than a third-round pick for a comp pick for him. Getting a second-round pick for him now, based on what he's shown the past years, is huge value for the Steelers. Getting the same pick back, and potentially an even higher pick than you end up spending on him, based on what he's shown the past 2 years, is just a slam dunk move for me.
Yeah, and rarely do you get the same amount of capital out of a player that you put into the player when you've already got to use him for 2.5 years, and especially considering the fact that I think he's playing the worst football of his career so far. Now, a lot of that is not his fault. I think that obviously Canada's offense factors into that a good deal, but he's averaging 2 full yards less per target this year. He's averaging 38 yards per game. So it's not like this is a make or break game-changing player. Now, he was in that second half of the Bucs game, but that was probably the best game that we've seen him play so far. And he's been a little bit inconsistent for sure. But I love this trade. I really do, because the Steelers, basically what you have to do at this point is what he did the first 2 years. It doesn't matter as much. What's happening right now is what matters, and looking forward. And so if I'm looking at Chase Claypool moving forward, I know that, first of all, I've already got a receiver on the team who's making $18 million a year. We just gave him a contract. Secondly, we drafted George Pickens in the second round. He absolutely looks like an up-and-comer that you are going to eventually want to pay if he continues to progress at this rate. And so knowing those two things, there was not a chance the Steelers were going to give Chase Claypool a contract, which essentially means that he's on a 20-some game rental at this point before he hits the open market and signs with somebody else. Now, theoretically, the Steelers could get compensation for him with a comp pick, maybe as high as a third-round pick. But I think that is incredibly unlikely when you factor in that Steelers are going to have money. And when they spend that money, it can cancel out that comp formula. So it's possible that they could have got nothing for him, depending on what they spend the following year offseason. And again, that pick wouldn't come until 2024. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this. If I can get a second-round pick and potentially an early second-round pick out of Claypool right now for a player who's averaging 38 yards a game and who has not been very consistent, and I think at best is typically the fourth in line for in the passing game in terms of targets, because you got to think that Freiermuth is as well. And so it just makes way too much sense. And they couldn't not take that trade like that. It was staring them right in the face. And what I love about all of this is it wasn't even the pick from the Ravens that they got. This was the pick from the Bears' original pick. And so right now, if the season were to end today, the Ravens' second round pick the Bears acquired would be the 57th overall pick in the draft. The Bears' second round pick would be the 43rd pick. There's a big difference between those two. And it could be the difference of multiple tiers talent-wise on the draft board when April rolls around. And not only that, but if the Bears don't have a very good second half of the season, it's possible that the Steelers could wind up with 3 top 40 picks, which I think is excellent. It's an excellent step towards a rebuild. So did they make the right move shipping him away?
I think you have to say right now for sure, because again, the only way that it isn't a good move is one of two things. Either Chase completely blows up with the Bears, figures it all out, which probably was going to happen with us anyway, but turns into a legit like number 1 type receiver, right? And if that were to happen, we would have had to pay him, which again, we probably weren't going to do regardless. That's, I think, the whole issue with this is anyone who's saying that, they wish they hadn't done it. I understand you might like Chase a lot, and I do think he's a very talented player, and I hope he works out for the Bears. I do. But unless you were super confident that this team was going to pony up the money to keep him if he plays well, right? Because if he doesn't play well, you're not going to keep him anyway. But if he plays well enough for a second contract, I don't know if they were going to give it to him. So it doesn't make sense to hold on to a player that doesn't factor into your long-term plans at this point. And even if he would end up doing that, he's just going to end up costing you a ton of money on a new contract, especially with the way receivers are getting paid right now.
Yeah, and I feel like the one factor that I don't love is you are taking a young, athletic, big target away from a rookie quarterback who's already struggling pretty heavily right now. And so that definitely has to factor in. I understand that when people make that argument, but I mean, we're talking about a high second round pick for a team that, like I said, if they go 7-2 from here on out, are not guaranteed to make the playoffs. We have to project forward next year too. So Claypool would be on the Steelers for one more season. He's under contract for one more year. But what is next year's offense going to look like? Is the Steelers going to be in a position where they can turn it around so much in one offseason that they can contend with the Bills and the Chiefs? Because I always go back and I say, what is the end game here? Is it to strive for mediocrity and to keep your head above water, to try to get back to an 8-9 record or a 7-10 record? Or is it to really try to make a push for the future where 2 or 3 years from now, you could be a good football team? And I think this was a great step in that direction. Let's move on for now. We'll get back to Chase in a little bit here, but let's talk about the William Jackson trade. And this one had a very different feel to me because you are not trading for draft capital like you are with Chase Claypool. You are not trading for a young player who can be part of the team for the future. We're talking about a 30-year-old struggling cornerback on an equally bad football team that the Steelers have traded for. And I understand the struggles that they have at the position right now, but this one, it was kind of head scratching, especially that the Commanders had come out and said that William Jackson was going to be cut if he was not traded for before the deadline. So I know that it was very low risk, but what do you make of this one?
I try not to really criticize this one too much simply because of how little it means ultimately in any way. The trade is just late round pick swaps and conditional things. And they clearly wanted to add to the cornerback room to try to give the secondary a better chance to compete. I think William Jackson, whenever he's healthy and in a man scheme and playing more man coverage, which is what they're going to ask him to do when he's here, he could be an above average corner again because he has been in the past. I think the scheme didn't fit him. He even talked about one of the reasons he wanted traded is because of that. So I'm hopeful that he is going to be a valuable player the rest of the year. What that means after this year, probably not much. I don't imagine that he's definitely not going to stay around at his price tag. Maybe he takes a pay cut. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know what that'll look like, but it doesn't ultimately mean that much to me. I think it just is them trying to say, hey, we want our secondary not to get torched every week. And if Kyle Witherspoon isn't getting it done, I don't love it just because, again, I don't think it helps them enough for it to matter and also hurts them slightly if it does help them win a little bit when right now winning isn't really going to help you very much right now. But I try to just kind of put it as good for them that they wanted to add somebody, I guess. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking late round pick swap here, so it's probably not going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. I personally wouldn't have done it. I just think that, I mean, the Steelers, the cornerback room is healthy enough at this point, and Witherspoon has come off a really bad game, but also William Jackson has been really bad this year. And so I feel like you have to factor those things in, and I have to go back to it, and I have to accuse him, even though I don't know, but Mike Tomlin loved William Jackson back in 2016. This was the guy he was going to draft. and he was stolen from him. One pick before the Steelers were on the clock, and Tomlin ultimately went with Artie Burns. We know how that turned out. So when he found a chance to once again get a cornerback like William Jackson that he really liked, we'll see how it goes. But again, this is nothing more than half a year rental. And so you're doing a pick swap exchange. You're forking up $3.1 million this year for a half a year rental for a 30-year-old cornerback, because in my mind, I'm thinking the Steelers' reasoning is Tomlin wants to win football games right now. He's made that very clear all the way up through the trade deadline. He wants to win right now. He's not in the business of tanking, and he thinks that William Jackson can help him do that. Whether or not he'll be a step up from James Pierre or Akella Witherspoon on the outside, I really don't know, because I think he's kind of been honestly in the same boat as those guys there. And so maybe the change of scenery will help him out a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Let's make an announcement, and then we'll move to our next topic here. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right, Shane and I are going to talk about what are the next steps in this Steelers rebuild. I love what they did. Like I said, with the Chase Claypool trade, they don't ever think forward like this. I mean, not that I remember, like under the direction of Mike Tomlin and Kevin Colbert, this is a present-minded football team who wants to win here and now. They're willing to give up future draft picks to do so. We saw that when they traded a first-round pick for Minkah Fitzpatrick. I don't know how many years in a row they traded a fifth-round pick away to get
for somebody.
Starter. Yeah, somebody. Vance McDonald, Avery Williamson, and Akella Witherspoon. Who's the other tight end? Seattle guy. I'm drawing a blank right now.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. It wasn't like Luke Wilson, or is that a different guy?
No, it wasn't
Luke
Wilson. I just wrote about him the other day, and then I can't think of his name right now. But
I can't either.
It's year after year. They're always doing the moves like this, where it is, I'm not concerned about the future. I want to win right now. And you can understand it like from that window. You're in Ben Roethlisberger's last years. You're trying to make a push, even though I thought the last year or two was a little bit naive thinking that something like that would put you over the top. But now we're finally in a state where the Steelers have one of the youngest offenses in the league. They're a pretty bad football team right now. And so you have to think forward. And so I don't know how much of this is the change going from Colbert to Andy Weidl and Omar Khan, but I really got to give those guys a pat on the back for what they did. And I have to think that Andy Weidl certainly had a hand in making that move happen, because this is the assistant GM that the Steelers brought in. He was from Philadelphia, and he's the one that helped kind of turn that football team around. He focused on the trenches. He traded back in the draft. He stockpiled draft capital. And the Eagles are in a fantastic way right now, even with their draft capital coming up next year. And the roster just got so much stronger. So I really like that what Steelers were able to do right there. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, who do you think was responsible? Like, who do you think had that ultimate say?
Right. I will say real quick, I think it was Nick Van Nett was the tight end. Is that who it was?
You're right. That's
okay.
it.
I just had to throw that out there. So
yes, thank you. Thank you.
But no. Honestly, this smells like an Eagles move, doesn't it? Like an Eagles style move of getting a second round or a way too high of a pick for a player that probably isn't worth that pick at this moment in time. So I have to feel like Weidl probably had a lot of to do with this. I do think Khan is definitely a different type of GM than Colbert was. So I do think, of course, he was comfortable with this type of move. And honestly, it's just nice to see, regardless of who really ultimately put this together, that they are willing to do these types of things, right? Because that was the concern I had coming into the deadline, and really this year in general, were these guys willing to look at this team objectively and go, yeah, we're just not there right now, and we need to get there. And now the way to do that is to get draft picks, to get capital that we can use to get players that we need to add. And that seems like what they're willing to do, and I'm really glad to see it overall.
Yeah, I thought one of the worst things that Colbert did over the last couple of years before he had stepped down as GM was he would just try to reload every year and basically essentially run it back with the same team, plus or minus a few stopgap free agents that really didn't make a difference. They didn't move the needle one way or the other. The Eric Ebrans and the Trey Turners. And I just don't feel like that was the way that they should have been operating. Like if it was me, I probably would have done a little bit different. I think you need to be all in, like the Los Angeles Rams were when they made their Super Bowl push, or you need to be all out. And the Steelers are rarely in a situation where they need to be all out, but now potentially might be that time, because we're looking at, like I said, the league's worst offense, a mediocre defense, a team that is not deep anywhere on the roster, not even at wide receiver, the one position that I initially thought that they would be deep at, because you had Claypool as your number 3, and you had Calvin Austin that you drafted in the 4th round. You had Anthony Miller, who ended up on IR ultimately. And now this team is razor thin again, even at the receiver position. So everywhere on the depth chart, just everywhere, they are so thin. And so I think the team needs just a true rebuild. So we're going to talk about how that's going to happen. Shayne, I want to ask you, do you think that the Steelers should have made more proactive moves before the deadline? Should they have traded away someone else, like a Larry Ogunjobi, perhaps?
I think that if they would have gotten a fair offer and a decent offer for anyone else, I think they would have moved on guys like that. My guess is that nobody came calling with anything enough for them to feel like it was worth it. Because for a guy like Ogunjobi, like obviously you want like at least a decent mid-round pick because he's played really well for you this year. Again, they're still in this mode of like they don't want to be downright terrible, and you know that Tomlin is not tanking, right? He's not going to want them to trade guys away just because. And I know that that isn't really the style we want to go with at this point because we know this team is in a full rebuild. But I do get, like, if you're getting like 5th and 6th round pick offers for a guy like Ogunjobi, I'm okay with them saying no on that. He's a good player. He helps them right now. Hopefully will help the young guys, along a little bit too. But if they got offered like 4th round picks for him or anything like that, I would have definitely made that move. But my guess is that just no one else that they really wanted to have conversations about was getting decent offers.
Yeah, I would have liked to have been like a fly inside the front office there to see if there was any incoming calls about any of the other players on the team, considering the state of the Steelers right now at 2-6. And so I don't know if there was nothing out there that's confirmed, but it has to make you think, like, was there something on the table? Would they have considered moving on from a player like Ogunjobi, who we mentioned, who is on just a 1-year contract? And this is a guy that we talked about previously that had signed for $13 million a year with Chicago prior to them stepping out of the deal because they were concerned for health reasons. So theoretically, Steelers might be able to get a compensatory pick out of Ogunjobi depending on how they spend in free agency. And so there's always that, but it makes you wonder, like, if this team isn't going anywhere, could you have gotten a respectable pick out of Ogunjobi? Like, I feel like anything at this point that is part of that 2 or 3 year plan down the road where I can have a bunch of guys on rookie contracts. I can double my draft capital. Like, I feel like that's really how the Steelers should be operating. Yeah. And another a name that was thrown out there that was never a realistic possibility was Cameron Hayward. And it would have made sense for some teams to want to go after him. A team like Dallas that they have one weakness on their team right now, really on the defensive side of the ball, and that is stopping the run. We saw that in the Bears game that they just played. If they had a player like Hayward and you pair him with Micah Parsons and all the other guys that they have there in a contract year, you got that true one technique guy, like that would be enough potentially to put a team like that over the top to win a Super Bowl. And so it makes me wonder. I don't even know if teams would have bothered to ask because they
probably not. If I had to guess,
they know how the Steelers operate, and we do too. Like that would have just blown my mind. I don't even know what I would have thought about that, but that was something that was never on the table. But it was nice, again, to see the Steelers do at least one forward-thinking move. That's something that they are just not accustomed to doing at all. The Steelers have good draft capital now. So let's talk about that for a minute. I don't remember the last time that they're projected to have 3 picks this high. It probably wasn't in my lifetime anywhere. Because I think that, oh man, I'd have to go back and look at their draft history, but it was at a point in the 90s, they went 6-10. I think it was the year right before they drafted Polamalu. Or at least 1 or 2 years before that is somewhere in that region. And so definitely right now, it looks like they're projected to be worse than that. And in fact, that some people think that they might not win another game or 2 the rest of this year. And I'm not sure if they're going to be favored in anything. I'd have to go ahead and look at the odds. There might be one game that they're favored in all year long. And so it's very plausible that Steelers could end up with a top 3 pick or a top 5 pick this year. And so, man, we haven't had something like that in a long, long time. And that goes, again, with another 2 picks that could potentially be inside the top 40 or at least in the top 45 maybe. So what would you do with that draft capital if you're the Steelers?
I think realistically, so let's say working with the assumption that they do end up with, we'll say a top 5 pick, right? I think because you have the ability to move down from a top 5 pick and get even more capital and still stay within probably the top 15 or so picks, The players that I think that are most likely for them to be interested in and the positions they're most likely interested in, you don't necessarily have to draft somebody in the top 5, right? So I think it will ultimately come down to where their first round pick lies, is whether they move back or even possibly move up. Because no matter what happens with Pickett, I think just knowing how the Steelers operate and what they think about him, quarterback's not going to be in the conversation, right? Regardless of what things look like the rest of the year. So you don't need to have a top 5 pick for that reason. All the other players that you might be interested in that are worth a top 5 pick probably aren't the top needs, honestly, for your team. So being able to move back and have maybe even 4 or 5 picks in the top 50, 60 picks in a draft that I think a lot of talent is going to be able to fall in the second round at positions that they need. That would be how I would operate if you have a true top 5 pick. Now, if they end up finishing somewhere like just outside the top 10 or around 10, maybe the player that they need the most will be a good spot at that point in the draft. But it's a little early to say, of course, until we get closer to draft time.
Yeah, it would be so tempting if they get in a position where they can take like a generational prospect like Will Anderson,
right?
Not to jump on that because my goodness, Will Anderson and TJ Watt, I can't imagine those two playing together. And then you would have Highsmith as your backup, at least for the temporary. And I don't know what his long-term future is going to be for the Steelers, but something like that would be so interesting. But I do agree with you. I think that you look at the state of the Steelers, they're weak all around the roster, and especially with their depth. And so I think an ideal situation would be trying to trade back and multiply those picks because as many throws that you can get as the dartboard as possible, I think that's what's going to be best for them ultimately in the long run. And I think that other teams have had success doing the same, and Andy Weidel has with the Eagles as well. And so that's something that they'll definitely have to consider. The Steelers won't draft a quarterback. Like you said, I would just be completely floored. That just goes against everything that they do. They're not going to give up on a guy after 1 year. We're talking about the same team that started Jarvis Jones and Artie Burns for 3 years before they decided that they were bad football players. Yeah. So they're not going to give up on Kenny Pickett. But every Steelers fan should be rooting for these quarterbacks in the 2023 class to be amazing for the rest of the year, because we want to be in that position where a team could come up and offer us a king's ransom to trade back into the draft because somebody's coming up for one of those quarterbacks. And so we're hoping that this CJ Stroud and Bryce Young and Will Levis and all those guys have fantastic years the rest of the way here so that teams are willing to do that and good off seasons as well. And so that's something that fans should be rooting for, I think, right now. But I do agree with you. I think trading back is ultimately what's in the best interest of the Steelers. And let's talk about where we go from here, Shane. I don't actively root for Steelers to win games as it's happening. Like I'm not that kind of evil fan, but I do know that what's probably best for the Steelers in the future is really if they don't win a lot of games from here on out, because I just don't think that does them a lot of good. It's going to push your pick back in each round. So instead of, I think they need that elite player is what I'm trying to say. I think they need that genuinely elite football player. And if they don't get that elite football player, they need to be in a position where they can stockpile picks with a great trade back offer, because they haven't drafted an elite football player in my mind since TJ Watt. And if you go back before that, it probably hasn't been since David DeCastro. And so it just doesn't happen very often. And they need to get to that point again where they're drafting elite football players, where they don't have to go out and trade a first-round pick and take a gamble on a player like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who was struggling with his previous team. That doesn't always work out either. You want to hit in the draft. You want to build that way. And so, like we said, I think the trade back is the best-case scenario. What other moves, though, if you're the Steelers, would you try to make during the 2023 offseason?
I feel like the first thing you have to kind of look at is, one, the biggest offseason addition this team can make is a new offensive coordinator, right? Because we know it's probably going to be in the offseason that they do this move. And I think that is going to mean a lot for, one, how do they build the offense from there? If they bring in somebody who wants to kind of have a wide open passing game and mix in the run, finding a third receiver or drafting one is going to be really important, opposed to maybe just finding somebody to fill that role that can get it done, but nothing special. You're going to bring in a guy who's going to focus on trying to get us back to more of the ground and pound game with Harris and Warren and other guys. Then the offensive line interior, even though the interior hasn't really been the problem as much this year overall, upgrading there is going to become more important if they want to lean on the run game. That's going to be the first addition that kind of makes dominoes fall, I think. From there, though, once you know what you wanted to be on offense, you also have to figure out, okay, what is the future of this defense in the secondary? Is there guys in free agency that we can bring in that we think will be immediate impacts, and not just, stopgap guys like we've been getting, true difference makers at corner? And, obviously I think we kind of both agreed that the safety duo, we'd like to keep that the same at this point. But, if they don't feel that way, can you bring in a safety to help complement Minka other than Edmonds, if that's not what you go with, that type of thing. And then once you get to the draft, it's about filling out with players that have the chance to be foundational pieces, not just guys that can play a little bit, like Dan Moore. I appreciate his effort up to this point. We need a franchise left tackle. We need a franchise corner. There's just so many spots that we need a true difference maker at, that it's really anything they can get in free agency and in the draft at those positions, especially tackle, corner, edge rusher, even to help complement the pass rush, especially if someone gets hurt. We've seen how that affects us this year. That's going to be what they need to do to get this team back to a stable place, at least.
Yeah. What I want to hear coming out of Mike Tomlin's mouth right after the season in that first press conference is, we've decided to go in a different direction with Matt Canada, and we're looking for a different offensive coordinator, and that needs to happen. It's going to happen. Like, there's just no way that he keeps on. I don't care if those two are best friends. You need to make a business decision that is great for the organization, and that one is not. And so I'll be interested. I'll be really, really interested. I think that's going to be maybe the biggest topic of the offseason before the draft, because the draft will be huge with all these picks now. But who's going to be that offensive coordinator? Because that is going to shape Kenny Pickett in his development. It's going to dictate whether or not this team can get back on track fast, or if it's going to be a process. Again, if we're going to have to go through a couple guys before we find the one. So that's the first thing they need to do. And we're talking about free agency. My philosophy these last couple of years, I don't love the way the Steelers have been doing it. I think that some of their moves have been fine. Like I don't mind the James Daniels signing. I thought he was one of the better guys out there in free agency that you can get. But what I would do is, I think they really need to look at like 1 or 2 or 3 young cornerstone foundational pieces that they could add to this roster that they can give long-term contracts to, and stop doing the stuff that they've been doing. Stop getting the Eric Ebrans, the Trey Turners, even the Miles Jacks. I don't know what the Steelers are going to do with Miles Jack next year. I wouldn't keep him at that cost. I think he's going to be $11.5–12 million next season. And we're talking about a guy who's really struggled in coverage this year, that I think the best way to describe him is probably just an average at best starting linebacker in the NFL, maybe below average. I just feel like those are the type of signings that we can kind of do without. I'd rather let that money either roll over or spend it on a foundational piece that's really going to be here part of this next championship window. So that's what I'm hoping for. And then when we get into the draft, I think it's critical that the Steelers spend their picks, at least their top picks. You take the best players at the most important position. I know that sounds super obvious, but the Steelers haven't done that.
No,
they've taken players because of need, and they've taken players because of the scouting area that they like, because of like, for example, the Terrell Edmonds pick. Like, nobody thought that Terrell Edmonds should have been taken in the first round. I think he's done a good job turning his career around since his first 2 seasons, but nobody thought that he should have been taken in the first round, nor was he a threat to go by any other team in the first round. The Steelers probably didn't need to take him there, because they probably could have taken him a round later, but because they had a need at the safety position, they were willing to take him early and ignore everything else. And safety is not a premier position, doesn't get paid high. It's why a player like Terrell Edmonds sat in free agency so long, and you were able to sign him back for $2.5 million. And so that shouldn't be the focus of the Steelers front office in the NFL draft. It should be try to get cornerstone foundational players at important positions. You need a left tackle. You're probably going to need an edge rusher that's going to be the future across from TJ Watt, if they're not willing to give up really good money for Alex Highsmith. And we'll see how that situation plays out. But whether you are or not, one of those top 3 picks could probably be used on the edge anyway, because your depth is so poor. Yeah. And we saw that this year, like with Malik Reed. And so they need a cornerback. You need 2 starting outside cornerbacks. And so you got to get at least one of those in the draft. And something that irks me, I know I'm rambling on here, so just bear with me one more minute. Something that really irks me is when everybody says the Steelers don't know how to draft and develop cornerbacks. That's true to an extent, but you have to consider the Steelers have taken 1 first-round cornerback since Chad Scott in 1997. It's not like they're throwing, again, a lot of darts at the board here. when you're only doing it's that small of a sample size, is it really good enough to go off of and say, let's never do this again because they failed taking Artie Burns, or let's don't do it again in the second round because they failed with Senquez Golson, who never saw a snap because of health reasons. I don't think that that's fair to evaluate it that way. And just because the Steelers have made some mistakes in the past, misevaluating the talent, doesn't mean that you shouldn't try again. It is a passing league. Teams pass the ball 70% of the time. You need top-notch cornerbacks, and we see that when the Steelers play a good football team, they get destroyed via the pass, like the Bills and the Eagles. And so that's something they're going to have to target. That's my 2 cents. Shane, I'll let you get your last words in here before we sign off for today.
And like I said, I pretty much agree with everything you said. I think the biggest thing is you do have to focus on positions, not just of need, of course, which luckily and also unluckily, our positions of need also happen to be the most important positions for the most part. So I assume that those things will kind of just line up and Con will go, yeah, we need a tackle, we need corners, we need this, that. And I think that the only thing that I could see happening, and I don't even want to say it because I'm almost afraid it will just speak it into existence. Just don't take an off-ball linebacker in the first round. I know we're not strong in that position right now. And but I just don't do it. No team really should unless it's the very end of the first round just to get that like 5th year option. Because I mean, guys like Devin Lloyd has been great, is a late round first round pick, but you also have Quay Walker with the Packers, who's been absolutely terrible. Like it's just the hit rate's not there. Mm-hmm. Please do that. But if you take a tackle, if you get a premier corner, just don't be afraid to take those players, even though it's awful when they don't work out because you put so much effort into them and they're hard to replace. But you can't be afraid in this point in your rebuild. You have to be willing to take shots on players. There's going to be really talented corners and tackles in this draft that even if you don't end up with a top 5 or 10 pick, that are going to be there. And they need to understand like that's the positions they have to target. And if they don't, things are not going to get any better for them right now.
Could not agree with you more, especially about the off-ball linebacker thing. We know, obviously, the Steelers traded a first, second, and a future third for Devin Bush. Colossal mistake. But you have to kind of look at it this way. This is how I view it as well. If I went to every other 31 teams right now, and I offered them my first-round pick for an off-ball linebacker, there's not a team probably out there that turns that down because they understand the value of the position. But if I did that with my first-round pick, and I went out there and I offered everybody a first-round pick for their left tackle, there's probably a lot of teams that would turn that down because they know the value of positions. And Steelers need to understand that. Now with the new GMs in the front office with Omar Khan, Andy Weidel, I'm really, really hoping that they understand that you have to value certain positions higher than others. It's not just about need. So we're going to get into a lot more draft stuff this offseason. We're going to have so much to talk about once the season is over with when it pertains to the NFL draft. But during this slow week, this bye week that I guess wasn't really all that slow because we got some exciting trade news. We thought we'd break it down for you a little bit and we'll get back to our regular routine starting next week. So let's sign off here. Thank you all for joining us today on the Steel Curtain Podcast. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain Podcast wherever you get your podcast, and also check us out on YouTube. And thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain Podcast.